Welcome. Thank you for joining Fielding Graduate University and the Worldwide Network for Gender Empowerment, or WING, for the Women in Leadership Advocacy, Equity, and Wisdom webinar. I'm Kirsten McGregor, Associate Director for WING, and this webinar is the second in a series of 3 women leadership events. For the past decade, WING has been working on critical issues around the globe focused on gender empowerment. WING is an engaged and diverse ecosystem comprised of global members committed to research, collaboration, and action in support of women's and gender issues. Our mission is to impact change in critical areas including education, poverty, healthcare, environment, violence prevention, equality, and globalization. WING is also a United Nations non-governmental organization. As an international NGO, we represent global members and contribute to issues of critical concern to the global development agenda. Today, our webinar event will explore gender leadership from 3 unique perspectives. The conversation aims to provide insights and share the wisdom learned from years of research and world practice. Our agenda follows 4 general segments. First, an introduction to our panelists, which is then followed by 3 presentations. We'll then have a moderated panel discussion, and finally we'll close with a Q&A. We won't be addressing questions during the first 3 segments, but please submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to answer them during the last segment. To lead this discussion, we have Dr. Anna DiStefano, who has been part of the Fielding community for over 30 years and has served in several senior executive capacities. She is currently faculty chair for the School of Educational Leadership for Change and is a founding member and director of WING. Good morning, Anna. Thanks for joining the panel discussion today.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you, everyone, for making time in what I know must be very busy schedules, wherever you are in the world and wherever you are in your day. It's my privilege to introduce these 3 panelists, 2 of whom are Fielding alumni and 1 who is a current Fielding student. And I'm sure that what they have to say will be both provocative, interesting, and memorable. So let me just quickly give you an overview of who the 3 are, and then we'll quickly move to their presentations. Dr. Ann Litwin has been a consultant and a coach for more than 30 years. What I find noteworthy about her background, among the things I find noteworthy in her background, is her service as past chair of the board at NTL. Look for her book, which will be coming out soon in this year, in New Rules for Women, Revolutionizing the Way Women Work Together. My experiences of Ann lead me to emphasize the part of her bio where she talks about, or we talk about, the courage to grab the moment. I think of Ann as a very courageous person, and I think that you'll find that in her comments today. Our second panelist will be Byrd, a current Fielding student, although, as those of you who know Fielding know, that doesn't mean that she hasn't done a great deal already. In fact, quite an accomplished consultant and operations executive with more than 20 years experience. She's pursuing her PhD in the Human and Organizational Development Program, and she is currently Senior Operations Executive at United Lex. I think when I think of Ann, I think of the word transformation, and I think she's very interested in her own transformation and in the transformation of others, especially women. Our third panelist is Sharon Buckmaster, also a coach and consultant, and an HR leader in the past of 2 Fortune 100 companies. She founded the Women's Center for Leadership, now in its 13th year, as a leadership development venue for women in the Portland, Oregon area. And when I think of Sharon, I think of agility. I think of agile. And I think that you'll notice that in the content and manner of her remarks today. So I don't want to take too much time except to say Please do jot down your questions or notes for the chat for later on. We would like to keep to the time as much as possible. So without further ado, I am going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Ann Litwin. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm delighted to bring a bit of my research to you all today on women in organizations. My research was about looking at patterns, how women would describe patterns of relationship between the women in organizations. And I got interested in this topic because as a consultant and a coach, while of course I often hear women talking about how other women are supportive to them in their organizational life, I heard way too many stories about women who are not feeling supported by other women in their work, in their workplace. And as a long-time committed feminist who is committed to working to improve women's lives, as well as an organization development consultant committed to improving organizations, I felt that I wanted to do this research to see what I could discover about how to understand what was going on in women's relationships in the workplace for the purpose of really seeing if there were things that might be helpful, both to women and organizations, that could come out of this research. And I did find some things that I think are helpful. I'm going to share just a little peek at some of it today. I did this research, so I looked at how women would describe patterns of relationship between women, and I discovered a range of patterns. I call it a range of patterns because I'm sure that there are many more that I did not surface from the research, but an interesting range did emerge, and I was able to see both. There were many surprises for me in what did emerge, and so there were patterns that were very positive, of course, and patterns that were very negative. Some things in between, and some big surprises. So one of the challenges of doing research on women is something I call paradox, which is that it's difficult to talk about women as a group because we're so different. We have so many differences in cultures and in perspectives and ways of being in the world. And so I challenged myself, and I continue to challenge myself to look at women and acknowledge our differences as well as our similarities. So in the research, I tried to hold both to be listened for what were the differences as well as similarities in the experiences that women had in organizational life. So it's both and. That makes it possible to say, well, we do have some things in common. There is this gender factor that we have in common, but also at the same time we have differences. So it's important to be able to do both. There are two frameworks that really emerged to hold the patterns that came out of the research, and I'm going to focus on one of them today. The two patterns are friendship rules in a man's world, which is the one I'm going to talk about in a moment, and the other is internalized negative stereotypes. So those are like the two frameworks, but I'm going to focus now on the one that I'm calling friendship rules in a man's world. So this theme of friendship rules really emerged as a surprise for me, and it's a theme that runs through several of the patterns. And these are friendship rules that I'm calling them friendship rules, but they are really like they're relational expectations or relational images that we carry about how other women are supposed to behave. We begin to develop these expectations very young. I have a 4-year-old granddaughter who is able to describe her relationship expectations to other girls already, and so and men have relationship expectations as well, but they're different because of our different socialization. So I got very interested in women's friendship rules because as they began, these expectations began to surface. And I realized that as the women described their experiences with each other in organizations and their experiences in organizations, that these friendship rules, which I'll go over with you in a moment, I'll show you sort of what a core group of women's friendship rules look like. I began to realize as I listened and that these friendship rules were we carried them in as adult women into organizations. We're carrying these expectations that we develop very young. They become unconscious as we get older, but they're operating within us as like filters through which we are interpreting the behavior of other women in organizations, through which we are determining our reactions to other women in organizations, and we don't even realize that we're doing it. And the friendship rules themselves, the women's friendship rules themselves, are fairly egalitarian and kind of flat structured. We're carrying them into the hierarchical workplace, where it's really men's friendship rules that have established the cultures because the men were there first. So we carry these women's friendship rules into the masculine hierarchical workplace, and they crash into each other and create confusion for us as women about what to expect from each other. And so this is one of the things that that began to surface very clearly and to help to make sense of a number of the patterns that came up. But I want to say this word friendship can sometimes be confusing because I'm not talking about, you know, the friends at work, and people say, why are you talking about friends at work or workplaces for working, right? It's not for friendship. But what I'm really talking about is our expectations of each other and how we can strengthen our ability to support each other by becoming more aware and gaining some skills around being able to recognize our own expectations, unconscious expectations of other women, and be able to name them and negotiate them. So the purpose of talking about friendship rules is to be able to strengthen our relationships with each other at work. So I'm not able to see the screen, so I'm not sure if you're able to see the slides. But there is a list of friendship rules in the literature that my participants were able to validate it, and ended up having there's a core group that shows up in the adult women's literature that also showed up in my participants list. Are you able to show that slide, Kristen? Women's friendship rules?
Yes, we have friendship rules are up.
Okay. Well, I have to. They're up? Okay.
Yes.
Good. So, all right. So if you take a look at this list, just give you a moment to glance at it. You'll see that there's a lot of expectation of equality. There are also a lot of conflicting expectations. And most importantly, if you look at the last one on the list, which says we don't discuss our friendship rules, you can see that there are some real landmines sort of waiting in a number of different ways for women when they carry these expectations, or expectations like these. It's not that we all have the same ones, of course, but these are common ones that show up really fairly often. And it's one of them is it's taboo to discuss our friendship rules. So this has important implications in lots of ways in terms of being able to name our, because we don't have the same, we're not going to have all the same expectations of how women are supposed to behave. And so if we feel like we can't talk about it, or she should just know, then we aren't able to really work through any misunderstandings that we may have, and it can really damage our work relationships. Let me just say this also has huge implications for women who are bosses of women, or trying to be the leaders of women, directors, supervisors of women, because these friendship expectations also get put on women bosses, and I think it's one of the reasons why women, as well as men, but women often say they prefer working for men, because they know what to expect from men, but we get very confused about what to expect from other women. I'll just go to the flash a couple of slides, change strategies and coaching tips at the end, because I'm at the end of my time, but I really think that this has turned out to be something that has potential to help us as women be more supportive of each other, not feel confused or betrayed so easily by each other if we can become aware of our friendship rules and learn how to name and negotiate them with each other. So that would be the end of my remarks.
Thank you very much, Anne. Obviously, there's so much material here we could spend a day together rather than just a few minutes together. So thank you for at least piquing our interest and giving us something to talk about with each other in a few minutes. It's my pleasure to now bring onto the presentation Ann Byrd, who will talk to us about something she's calling the stall. Ann?
Hi all, it's Ann Byrd. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this extraordinary event. You know, in this multi-year process, developmental process of becoming a PhD, there are a number of sort of questions that have come across my plate. You know, part of the PhD process is to sort of to establish the field of study that, you know, sort of burns you deeply. And for me, you know, as much as I sort of wanted it to be something else, something not gender for the love of Pete, you know, something not about women, I couldn't come back to this burning question that was really sort of selfishly about me. And that was what was going on with me, you know, what was wrong really was my question with me, that I couldn't kind of get it together in any sort of consistent way. And so I started thinking about that in a deeper way. You know, I wanted to really understand what was wrong with me, what was going on with me. And the best description I had for it was this state of what I'll now call diminished achievement after prior success, called the stall. You know, and it's a question of, you know, why are there sort of ebbs and flows in my successes, my strings of successes? Why are there these pauses in my ability to sort of hold the energy? And I don't yet know the answer to that, but I know more of what it isn't and what it is. So by definition, by my definition, and I don't find this terminology in the literature, so I've constructed it, and I'm more than welcome to have someone tell me that I've missed an entire school of thought, and there it is. But by my definition, the stall is the state of pause, if you will, between successes. And I provide some examples. You know, the first is that, this is a personal example, I'd lost an absolute ton of weight, so I was no longer going to die of gross obesity. But I hadn't lost enough weight to not be considered obese by our medical standards or to sufficiently reduce my risk of heart attack, stroke, and diabetes. And I needed to figure out why I couldn't sort of get back on that path. It's not like I didn't know what to do. Something had just sort of shifted in my focus and energy. Another example, I work with lawyers, and to become a partner in a law firm, it requires an enormous amount of considered, conscious, focus. So now that we've sort of had that focus and achieved partner status, why aren't we still achieving? And the third example has to do with my, you know, sort of academic experiences, and that's why I witness every day incredibly brilliant people sort of fall out of their academic program. In the professional space, you know, we talk about the numbers of women who check out of the workplace, who take off ramps, who are not interested in leadership roles, you know, who sort of opt out. And I put it all in the sort of same category of the stall. So I really wanted to understand that more. And there's not data in this terminology that I've made up, but there is literature in other categories. And I started to look at sort of the events and figuring out where this was situated in the academic space. I started to look at why it mattered. And it matters as a condition, I think, because we suffer. You know, women suffer from diminished self-esteem as a result, and diminished self-image and self-confidence as a result. We have lower levels of life satisfaction, lower levels of education and economic well-being as a result of our inability to sort of persist in this thread of achievement. And at the global level, if we sort of amp the magnitude of those problems up to global concern, we really get to negative impacts on recovery efforts in any sort of category, to negative impacts on disease and stress management, and negative impacts on rates of personal savings and other measures of professional satisfaction and thereby GDP. So, you know, the stall is relevant. I think it's really important to understand that it's relevant. I then sort of wanted to figure out the so what of it, right? In the academic world, we have a number of schools of thought that feed into this stall space. We've got biology, and inside of that broad science, we've got social and affective neuroscience. A lot of stuff going on in the psych space, including sort of human trait development and human motivation, goal setting, failure and resilience. And I think failure and resilience will end up being key. And then the issue of gender studies, you know, the fact that this is different for men and women at this point in my discovery. The literature will say, and it sort of uses the word stuck, right, getting unstuck, and it says that it's a psychological condition where we're not able to shake our existing developmental failures, right? So we sort of fail to develop in a certain way, and now we are, you know, processing through how we recover, if you will, that failure to develop. I don't necessarily think that's true. I don't think it's true in my case, so I think if I have one sample, one data point where that is not true, then there's another answer. And maybe there are 52 million other answers, but I think there's at least one. And what I want to really understand is what the other answers are. So the research, you know, begins, and I start to be in conversation with other people who are having this experience, who are, you know, trying to figure it out for themselves, who are, you know, trying to understand what's going on in them. And outside of that, then, I want to understand whether or not I can predict this behavior, whether I can prevent this behavior, and how it serves us, because I think, you know, we sort of generally do things that serve us. So that's inside of the stall what I want to understand. For the women in particular, I want to know if it's their story, right? How does this story of the stall show up for them? How do they construct their story and thereby their reality? And then, you know, I want to understand if it's them. You know, is it just the story they're telling themselves, or is it in fact them? I don't know the answer to the questions. You know, what I have passion for, though, is figuring it out, because at the end of the day, you know, what I really have passion for is what's possible for people, and in particular what's possible for women. And I think, you know, to the extent that we can understand what's happening with women, what's happening with success, and stringing together a more reliable pattern of behaviors and self-confidences and results, we win. And at the end of the day, while I said at the beginning I didn't have any interest in studying gender, I find that I don't have any option but to do so. And you know, this is an area of research that's underway in my life real time, and I'd love to talk to you if you think you've got a story to tell, and because you're a woman and on this call, I suspect you do. So I look forward to what you have to say, and as soon as I know more, I'll share more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ann. I really appreciate that. I have all kinds of questions I'm already thinking about asking you. So
thank you.
I'll look forward to the interactive segment. Now my pleasure to introduce our last presenter, Sharon Buckmaster. Sharon, take it away.
Thanks very much. Well, my presentation is kind of almost a perfect bookend to Ann Litwin's, because at the time I was doing this research, the literature was full of stories about women who were, you know, queen bees and the like, and I had seen a number of women, maybe not the majority, but certainly a number of women who had served as terrific advocates for other women, and I wanted to know what makes somebody become an advocate for other women. Next slide, please. So what I was looking at was what is the process by which senior level women become aware of the need for advocacy and then decide to take it on, and sometimes at some risk to themselves. Next, please. So I was looking at what kinds of experiences and circumstances went into shaping that behavior in someone's life. So I interviewed a number of senior level women, and it was really interesting to find them because as soon as I started looking for people, there were certain women who stood out. Everybody knew that these were women who had truly been advocates for others. And I saw a series of themes. Not everybody had all of these themes, but they each had several. And one of them that stays in my mind to this day was a woman who ultimately became the head of a foundation that does tremendous work in the developing world with women and girls. And she had had an experience as a young woman where she had been sent to a school in Switzerland for a year. I guess her parents thought a year of finishing school would be, useful to her in a number of ways. Little did they know. But she had, during that year, she had met a number of young women from some country on the Arabian Peninsula. I'm probably not being politically correct in that terminology, but it was somewhere where women and women and equality or equity, that was just not even in the ballpark. But she saw these very, very bright young women. There were, I guess, 3 of them there, being educated as she was, and they would talk about how they were going to go home to a situation where they would be shut away, they would be behind closed doors, they had to go everywhere escorted by men, et cetera, et cetera. And she said she cried. She cried herself to sleep at night, really realizing the enormous tragedy of that. And she committed herself to a life where that would be front and center for her. So that kind of story was not unusual for people. They weren't all that dramatic, but next, please. But they clearly, as my friends call this, the propeller model. And sorry, I did work for an airline for a long time. But in this model that I developed, there were women who, if you look at the area on the lower right-hand side, for them, dealing with gender equity issues was really part of their responsibility as a leader. They saw that it made sense to do it. They felt it was part of their responsibility. They were the kind of people who talked about framing diversity as a business issue, which we hear so much about. We did then, but even more now, I think. But it was somewhat further away from their personal core than the women in the group that's on the upper right side, where for them it was the right thing to do. It gave them joy. they got a lot of pleasure out of being engaged and involved with other women and helping their careers. But the group that I really had the most actual personal resonance with, and the group that I really started out to study, was the group that's on the left-hand side. And for those people, it wasn't a choice. I'm reminded of what Ann Byrd said about, she kind of didn't want to study gender issues, but it wound up being, something she couldn't avoid. It was right there for her. And I kind of came to this the same way. It was something I felt like I had no choice about. It was the work that I've done all my life, the work that I couldn't not do, and the work that I continue to do. And even as I look towards, what I will do ultimately after I retire, whenever that is, it's the work that I, although in a different form, intend to continue doing. And so for those women, it was so much a part of who they are that it was really part of their personal DNA. So I had a number of findings that helped distinguish between the process of becoming an advocate and sustaining advocacy, and noted that it was a progression over time, that people didn't just become an advocate immediately, that they put their toe in and then their foot, and as they got further and further into it, it did become more of their way of being in the organizational world. My recommendations included at that point developing, putting more of an emphasis on gender, on same-sex gender groups within organizations. In my early career at United, next please, at United Airlines. That had been a very formative experience for me, and it helped me to develop the organizational savvy and political skills that you see highlighted in this next slide. And I'd like to return to that a bit later. But at the same time, I noticed that there were lots of women who were doing well and doing good, that they didn't have to be mutually exclusive, that not a lot of women at that time had particularly sophisticated tools for advancing gender equity within organizations. I think we've made some progress there, but I think there are still some gaps there. And I think we'll talk more about that in our group discussion. But one of the things that I did speak to was this need for having same-sex groups within organizations. And I would say now, about 10 years later, that's a finding that I forgot that I did want to talk about some of the newer research that I've been looking at, which speaks to some of the findings that both I and I think the other women have already been speaking to. The work in neuroscience now, the work that is available to us through the functional MRIs, really does point to some small but significant differences in the way women's brains are structured from men's. In this particular image, you'll see that this is a picture of the hypothalamus, and the left side is women's, the right side is men's. You'll see that the women's is larger, and that speaks to women's ability to hold on to the emotional content of experiences that they have. And you know, I think it's important to recognize that when we speak about women ruminating or, you know, processing or over-processing the way they feel about a particular event, in some ways, I think we're just perpetuating the old, you know, woman as victim, because in fact, our brains do that more easily, more readily than men's brains do. And if we know that, if women know that, and men know that, I think that's useful because it allows us to reframe that behavior as not aberrant or abnormal or something that needs to be eliminated, but it may in fact be useful if you think about, for instance, a sales call where a woman's ability to be able to process some of that emotional content that she may have picked up in the call, or, you know, or the visit, well, that may become a business advantage. So I think that using some of the information that we have now through the neuroscience advances can be really helpful. And so now that we come back finally to this last slide where I had recommended that we, initially, that we have women's only networks. I think that's still useful if there are women's only groups that are meeting outside of the organizational context, where if women have a need to discuss issues that they feel are relevant, that they are more comfortable talking about at this point only with other women, that's great. But internally within organizations, I think the time has come for us to really allow men who get it, and I think particularly in the younger men in the business world now, there are lots and lots of men who get it and really want to be part of the solution, and I think embracing them and moving towards more balance in management as opposed to an emphasis so much on promoting women would be a good thing. So I hope that that helps us move now into a discussion amongst the panelists around our findings and what we're seeing in the literature these days. So I think I'm going to let it go with that.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks very, very much. Thank you to all three of you. So I have a few questions, and I'm sure people will add questions from the audience as well. Let's see, we can put on our cameras and so people can take a good look at us. Pardon me. Let me ask you something. I'm trying to think about Anne's comment, Anne Litwin's comment about a both-and approach to thinking about these things. And I was thinking about the contrast between, to some extent, Anne Litwin and Sharon's emphasis on relationships and the between and among women kind of perspective, and Anne Byrd's emphasis on the intrapersonal, or the woman's individual sense of herself as having stalled or not moved forward. So I was trying to think about the relationship of those two perspectives, and I was wondering if one of our rules, picking up on Anne Litwin's piece, is that we don't talk about, we don't make observations about when other women are having difficulty, or like the stall, for instance. Mm-hmm. So if I'm in a workplace and I see some version of Anne Byrd's stall, is it a rule, generally speaking, that we don't talk about that in a way that men might have, or other people, I suppose, might have? Or how are those two things related? Oh, an individual woman's difficulty and challenges and our sense of relatedness in the workplace and elsewhere.
Well, I have one observation about that, which is that, well, somebody earlier said, we have to be really careful about generalizations, of course, because, women are not a unitary group. There's enormous diversity within that group. But, actually in the last few years, and maybe it's just kind of in my age group, but I've known any number of situations where women, for instance, have become the caretaker for the go-to person for an aging parent or a spouse with Alzheimer's or dementia. And I've seen their women bosses, and to a great extent, their men bosses make enormous accommodations and extend tremendous empathy and caring. So I can't say that it never gets talked about. I've also, on the other side, though, seen the anger when that hasn't happened, and the woman does feel kind of invisible because she's carrying this enormous burden, which sometimes actually is part of her own personal stall. I love that term. And she feels like, she's had no choice because as the woman, she's been expected to just suck it up and take care of it.
Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts before I ask you to comment on other things you heard in each other? I don't want to dominate this part.
I would have, for me, I would have just said, it's a rule for me. I wouldn't talk about it at work. I will talk about it with my girlfriend. I'll talk about it with my, adult son. I'll talk about it with people who are in close proximity to me emotionally. But that feels to me like a big emotional risk. I don't see myself as a matter of sort of formal conversation, having that conversation with my peers, male, female, subordinate, superior. I don't see it happening for me.
And this is Ann Litwin. I think what I would say, I would take a look at another angle, which is that there are ways in which I think women are set up against each other in organizations to feel that it's other women who are competition. And so another angle on this might be that to see a woman stalling out who you might see as your competition would be, you wouldn't feel, you would be glad about it. Let me say once.
So let me ask, I'll ask one more question, and then I'll let you either ask questions of each other, or we'll see if Kirsten has some questions from the audience. What rules do you have personally in the workplace? I mean, other than the one you just talked about in terms of the stall, what other expectations do you have about your relationships in the workplace?
Well, this is Ann Litwin. I think I have I want to be able to have to be able to feel like to trust someone. And for me, how I get to that, can I trust someone, is am I able to share some things? Am I able to feel that I can count on a person, another woman, to to back me up and support me? And I think that it's pretty vague. What that means to me is not going to be the same as it means to someone else. And so I can easily decide I can't trust someone, and that is that's very detrimental to our working relationship.
Anyone else have a rule they'd like to share?
My rule is do good work. At the end of the day, it's not my boss or my client or my peers who know the quality of the work I've done, how hard I tried, what effort I put forward. I know that, and my rule for myself is, you don't go to bed until the day is done, and that's about doing good work to my standard. And
so let me this, I don't even know if this is on topic exactly, Ann, but so does that mean that your priority is your client versus your coworker, or is that a false
It may be
distinction?
my client in that moment. It may be my coworker in that moment. You know, it's a
Okay.
life is sort of one big giant snowflake. You know, or millions of little giant snowflakes, and you've got to make all of those decisions in the appropriateness of that unique situation.
Okay. Let me ask you to ask any of your presentations provoke a question for somebody else on the panel?
I have one for Ann Litwin. You know, I find both of these presentations completely fascinating, and you know, now I will go back and read your dissertations, and then call you daily, probably. But you know, one of the rules I work on in the rule space is no mean girls, right? What is it? You know, like if there were a magic bullet to help us be kinder to one another in the workplace, what would it be? What's the sort of magic potion for that?
Well, this is Ann Litwin. I think that for me, if we can understand the ways that a lot of what we experience as mean girl behavior, even starting as little girls, and then that we continue to experience in the work, but if we can understand that as structural and not about something that's wrong with women, but that and that's the internalized negative stereotypes, I think, that we are acting out about women being untrustworthy and unreliable. We act those out so unconsciously. If we can get conscious and we can create a sort of shared vision about how we want to be with each other instead, how we want to be supportive, how we want to be able to work together well, then I think that combination of awareness and a sort of shared vision can really break the pattern where it exists of negative interactions.
Well, this is Sharon. I think that you know, it also comes from that whole notion of, you know, kind of a scarcity mentality, and when you look at it, you know, from the abundance mentality, you know, it just puts a different shape around things. So if we you know, even as little kids, if we in a family, if we think about, you know, love being very limited, and you know, we're all competing for scarce resources, you know, and organizational life tends to, you know, to Ann's point about the structural reality, organizational life is pretty much built that way. That you know, there's a limited number of spots, there's a limited number of promotion opportunities, blah, blah, blah. So we're all competing for the same thing. And in the short term, we may not be able to really change that a whole lot, but if we at least put that out on the table and make it more, you know, something that people can look at and say, really, is this how I want to live my life? You know, are these the choices I want to make that just reinforce this way of being in the world?
So let me see if Kirsten has a.
So let me see if Kirsten has a question from the audience.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. One based on Ann Byrd's concept on the stall, and the question is, what thoughts do you have about how the stall serves us? What function does it serve, and why would I go into stall mode?
Yeah, I think sometimes stall is easier, right? I mean, you know, from a resilience perspective, in order to come out the other side, you have to make another change. You know, and I certainly know with me, I felt like, oh my gosh, I've changed everything. I can't change another thing. You know, I just cannot make one more change. Not today, maybe tomorrow. And I really think that there's, you know, sometimes we're just tired, you know, and of course the neuroscience around our brain seeking pattern and routine and repeated behavior, when you have to change another thing, you know, you literally feel that in your physical person. It's exhausting. It takes extraordinary sort of physical effort. And sometimes I think the idea of the effort is just so overwhelming that we just can't get there, you know. And so this is why I think there's something in this resilience space and this appreciation and practice and change that will help us do this better, smarter, faster, more.
Ann, one of the things that occurred to me was
Bill Bridges' work on transitions,
Mm-hmm.
and the notion of the in-between space being a necessary space to get from where you are to where you're going next. And then I had the image, not that I'm big into agriculture, but I had the image of a field lying fallow, there's just, and it speaks to what you just said. There's just so much production that you can ask from a living, breathing thing, and that there are periods of time when you actually, I wish we would hibernate in some ways. If you think of the positive metaphors, transition, hibernation, lying fallow, rather than the, I have to say, somewhat negative notions of the stall, which sounds like a plane that's about to crash, I wonder if it helps us to access more of the breadth of the experience rather than just one dimension of it.
Can I also add into that same question? We've got a lot of questions around the stall, Ann. Is the imposed stall, those that women that actually impose it on themselves, but also other questions relating to how does society impose stalls on women? What are those invisible barriers that may be out that we're not even aware of?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because I think to the extent that we can frame stall behavior in a productive and positive way, we win. Right, so to the point, where we can point to this as being a part of the natural state, a hibernation, a rest while we sort of rejuvenate and recover in between achieving events, then we win. It's the negative, what's wrong with me, why am I failing, why can't I do this, the grinding on our self-worth that I think is, the destructive component of this experience. And externally imposed stall, I think, is a different kind of question, because there are conditions that exist, certainly. We don't have enough experience for that promotion by someone's assessment, or, I'm not tall enough to play WNBA basketball. I also can't play basketball. To external constraints that are very real. There's things I could do in one of those categories and not the other. So I think there's reason for positive, affirming examination. That's what I'd like us to have a skill set for, a process for.
I also have a question about these issues and how they cross racial lines, and our attendee wanted to ask that to each of our panelists.
Well, in my case, any number of the people I interviewed were not Caucasian, and I didn't see in those people, in the group that I was looking at, anything that clustered, that suggested that race had anything to do with the particular issue I was looking at.
This is Ann Litwin. And for me, race and culture and sexual orientation and all those national differences, et cetera, I had a great deal to do with what I was seeing. And so I talk about intersectionality in my book in terms of understanding women's dynamics in the workplace. You have to understand all of these other layers of things that are going on across these other differences. So that's part of the both and.
Yeah, it's they're implicit in my work as well. It's a multiplying effect. So it's our story, it's our truth, it's who we are, regardless. Our whole story is just that. It's our whole story. And in order to understand sort of, I think, what's underlying our emotional sort of conscious state, this is the thing to understand, how it all shows up for us.
Well, thank you all for this. It's 10 o'clock, and thank you all for this great panel discussion. And thank you to our attendees. I hope we got to most of your questions. I would like to let you know that we will have a recording of this webinar. It'll be available in the next couple of days, and we'll post it to our website, Facebook, YouTube. And also, please join us for our last webinar in this series, which is on Wednesday, June 11th at 9 a.m. So thank you very much, and I wish everyone a great day.
Bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.